podcast is on writing good theory and good hypotheses in social science research. Let's get right into it. Writing a theory involves 4 basic steps. The first one is to identify the dependent and independent variables. Remember that the independent variable is the one that has the causal impact in your mind on the dependent variable. It is the one that explains variation in the dependent variable. Make sure in this process to properly identify your unit of analysis, which we have just talked about in the previous podcast. You'll also need to explain how the changes in the independent variable lead to changes in the dependent variable. What is the mechanism, in other words, for the independent variable to have the impact that you're proposing on the dependent variable? Explain why changes in the independent variable lead to changes in the dependent variable. So this involves a deeper theoretical discussion. What is that connection between the two? And perhaps in a slightly abstract way, but also in a concrete fashion. Also, you want to make sure to show how all variations in the independent variable lead to all variations in the dependent variable. You can't just simply say that X sometimes is negatively related to Y and sometimes it's positively related. That's not good enough. You need to be able to explain all the variation in the dependent variable using all the variation in the independent variable. It'll probably take a few pages for you to lay out all of this, and that's okay. Theory is meant to go on for at least a few pages in an article, and you should be able to, in this theory, be able to describe the key thing, how the independent variable affects the dependent variable. Always keep that in mind as you write your theory. Here's an example. So imagine that our dependent variable is war, and our independent variable is trade. Our unit of analysis will be countries in the 21st century. So, how do we explain the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable? Countries in the 21st century that trade with one another are less likely to go to war with each other than countries that do not trade with each other. War has a negative impact on trade. It can severely depress it or stop it altogether. As such, countries that trade with each other will avoid war to avoid the negative impacts it would have on trade. Now, contrast that very good example to a couple of poorly written examples. So here's poorly written example number 1. In this study, we focus on explaining why some House candidates in 2018 use party symbols while running for office, while others do not. We argue that personal level factors such as gender influence how candidates use party symbols. The dependent variable here is the use of party symbols. The independent variable is gender. The unit of analysis is House candidates in 2018. Okay, so all of that seems to be in order. But what's missing here is essentially how is it that gender affects the use of party symbols? Why are we proposing this to be the case? There isn't any explanation here for why we should think that females or males are more or less likely to use party symbols than the other gender. So, because that's not making any sense, this is a really poorly written theory. We need to have that theoretical connection. Let's do a second poorly written example. This article analyzes the use of vetoes in presidential systems. We argue that landmark legislation is more likely to be vetoed than non-landmark legislation. So the dependent variable is the use of vetoes. The independent variable is landmark versus non-landmark legislation. The unit of analysis is U.S. presidents. So the how is landmark legislation, when it's brought up by Congress, is more likely to elicit negative reactions in presidents and much more likely to result in vetoes. What's missing here is a deeper theoretical explanation for why it is that landmark legislation is more likely to be vetoed. Do presidents think that it's their prerogative to determine what landmark activities are and not the Congress's? Is this a power play that's happening? Are presidents just more conservative in terms of policy? Conservative meaning more restrictive in the ways that they view the effect of policy in the United States. What is it? I mean, there's no explanation for why we should think that this relationship between presidents likely to veto landmark legislation, why that should take place. So we don't have that information, and thus that is a poorly written example. Here's another good example, a well-written example. In this paper, we investigate the impact of cell phone technology on violent collective action in Kenya in 2010. We argue that the availability of cell phones allows political groups to overcome collective action problems more easily and avoid coordination issues as well. Utilizing data on cell phone coverage and the location of organized violent events in Africa, we're able to show that the availability of cell phone coverage significantly and substantively increases the probability of violent conflict. So this is good because we have an explanation here as to what's happening. Groups are able to use technology. They're able to use technology to overcome common collective action problems, such as free riding. They're able to gain commitments from their members and avoid those coordination issues that always happen with groups that are somewhat ad hoc. So, this violent collective action activity is a group activity, and it's more likely to take place if technology is present for them to overcome collective action problems. So showing the availability of cell phone coverage, connecting in particular significantly and substantively increasing the probability of violent conflict is something that follows from this good theoretical discussion. So that's why this is a well-written example. The dependent variable, use of violent collective action, perhaps number of instances of violent action. Cell phone technology is the dependent variable. As cell phone technology becomes more available, violent collective action also increases in likelihood. The unit of analysis is the public in Kenya in 2010, so it's a very specific time. And the how, as I just said. Cell phone technology increases, that leads to the use of violent collective action. That's a neat study there. Okay, let's talk about writing hypotheses. So moving on from theory, hypotheses are shorter. Theory can go on for several pages. A hypothesis can be one sentence long, simply stating how the variations on an independent variable relate to variations in a dependent variable. And again, we have to show how all variations in the independent variable lead to all variations in the dependent variable. All of this is testable. These hypotheses are testable. And the data are observable that allow us to test these hypotheses, observable in the real world. And good argument needs to come before the creation of hypotheses, because we need to understand where the hypotheses are coming from. So our first template is a probabilistic template. More likely than, less likely than. Likelihood goes along with the term probabilistic. It's useful with kind of a dichotomous construction of independent and dependent variables. A dichotomous variable only takes two values. Whether the condition is present is one value, whether the condition is absent, that's another value. Only two values in that particular variable. No other values are possible. So an example would be, as an independent variable, gender, identify as female, identify as male. Dependent variable, party identification, Democrat or Republican. And the hypothesis, women are more likely than men to identify as Democrats. Now what's not stated here, because that's in the theory section, is the actual theoretical rationale. So one type of theoretical rationale would be that females identify more with Democrats on the issues, and thus give Democratic candidates their support. But this is an example of writing a hypothesis. See how short it is? I really want you to be short in your hypotheses. So the more than, less than distinction works with the dichotomous variable. and also continuous variable. And a continuous variable is one that has more than two values. And those are usually, and not usually, always ordered. Thus, higher values mean something, lower values mean something. So a higher GDP per capita means the country is wealthier. A lower GDP per capita means the country is poorer. GDP per capita is a continuous variable. So our second template example involves institutions and policy. So the independent variable is showing the type of institutions that the country appears to be gravitating toward. Democratic institution or a dictatorial institution. So defense spending is the dependent variable, and it ranges from 0 or no defense spending at all to any positive monetary value. The hypothesis is that dictatorships allow more resources to defend spending than democracies do. Because in democracies, the rationale would go on to say, people have more spending priorities that governments need to satisfy. In a dictatorship, the population may not be able to express its policy preferences. So the government would feel carte blanche to spend more on the military. Governments do not feel this kind of carte blanche aspect in spending in democracies. In chapter 3, independent variable increases or decreases, dependent variable increases or decreases. And this works well with continuous variables. So GDP per capita is a good example of a continuous variable. Theoretically, its lowest point could be 0, but there is no country that has no income at all. But countries do have some fairly low per capita incomes, such as $100, $200 per capita. So that can be on the very low end. And the very high end, of course, is in the tens of thousands of dollars. That's an example of a continuous variable. So the independent variable is per capita income. The dependent variable is defense spending. As the per capita income of a country increases, the amount of resources the government spends on defense increases. So they go up together and should come down together as well. Lower per capita income, lower defense spending. All right, what are some common mistakes in writing hypotheses? Well, one is that the hypothesis just isn't related to the theory at all. So if you're working on, as some of you are, interested in immigration, if you're working on a theory about how borders impact immigration, you need to make sure that your hypotheses relate to the impact of borders on immigration. So you can't talk about something else in terms of your hypothesis. It has to be closely related to your theory. If you write a theory about countries going to war, make sure that your hypothesis relates to countries going to war, not individuals. Otherwise, you would be committing a violation of the units of analysis dictum. You need to have the right unit of analysis. You can't just shift back and forth. So if countries are going to war, you need to study the behavior of countries. If individual executives make the decision to go to war, then your study must be of those individual executives and their behaviors. So there needs to be a match in terms of your unit of analysis. Another common mistake is not identifying how the independent variable influences the dependent variable. So a couple of examples here. Some countries are more likely to go to war than others are. Well, it's like rolling the dice. There isn't much there that's of great value. What would make more sense is if you had a direction to it. Dictatorships are more likely to go to war with other countries than democracies are. That is what's called a directional hypothesis. The more dictatorships, the more likely there is to be war. The fewer the dictatorships and the more the democracies, the less likely there is to be war. So a second example of this would be that, and this is the incorrect one, wealthy countries have high standards of living. Well, no kidding. What does that mean? How is that a testable hypothesis? Well, it's not. Instead, you need to correct it. Wealthy countries have higher standards of living than poor countries do. So that's something you can measure and compare. You can compare wealthy countries to poor countries and see which countries do have higher standards of living. So those are common mistakes in writing hypotheses. We also need to identify types of relationships. There are positive relationships and negative relationships. Positive relationships mean that the independent and dependent variables move in the same direction. As the independent variable increases in value, so does the dependent variable. As the independent variable decreases in value, so does the dependent variable. They move in tandem, like a tandem bicycle. Negative relationship is where the two variables move in opposite directions. So as the independent variable increases in value, the dependent variable decreases. As the independent variable decreases in value, the dependent variable increases in value. So those are that's what's called a negative relationship. Now, to illustrate this, a graph will help. We put on and this is a kind of a convention when you do graphing. So on the y-axis, you always have your dependent variable. On the x-axis, you have your independent variable. The y-axis is called the vertical axis. The x-axis is called the horizontal axis. You can label the axes and then draw the relationship. So here's an example. As the per capita income of a country increases, the amount of resources the government spends on defense increases. With greater capacity and more resources at the government's disposal, it can spend more on all manner of public services, including defense. So we're hypothesizing a positive relationship. Increases in the independent variable, per capita income, go with increases in the dependent variable, the defense spending. Now, how does this look pictorially speaking? That's a positive relationship right there. So as you go across the y-axis, from left to right, from 0 out to 3,500, the y is increasing, relatively constant rate. So if that's the case, then this is a positive relationship. Higher values of the IV go with higher values of the DV. Okay, now we can think of this in a slightly different way. As the per capita income of a country increases, the amount of resources the government spends on defense decreases. This is an example of a negative hypothesis. Now, the rationale here would be that wealthier countries tend not to wish to disrupt their economies with war exercises. Thus, the emphasis on defense decreases, as does the money spent on it. Thus, the negative relationship: as the IV increases, the DV decreases. As the DV increases, thus, the independent variable will be decreasing. And we can show this with a graph as well. We can easily see that as the IV increases in value, then the DV is decreasing, and vice versa. As per capita income decreases, defense spending increases. Maybe countries that are relatively poor feel less secure as well. Maybe they're in tougher climates where their neighbors are more hostile. Could be another reason for why we hypothesize a negative relationship. Now, the only way to decide between these competing explanations is to test them with data, which we will get to in future podcasts.